Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Well, hello there. It's Zoe, and this is the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. Welcome back. Thanks again for listening. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be in your ears, and I am grateful for your listenership. In the world today on Planet Human, very cool story. Carbon labeling of food is starting to occur at Hilton Hotels menus around the globe. What is that? I hear you asking. It means on their menus in their restaurants, they have a carbon label next to their food choices to help guests decide if they would like to choose a meal that has less carbon impact or more carbon impact. Not surprisingly, many guests are choosing the low carbon impact menu choice. So what does this mean for you as a leader? Carbon pricing of your products and services is going to be and is growing as a big deal. So are you tracking your carbon? Are you mitigating your carbon? Are you minimizing your carbon? Are you trying to be carbon neutral? This is not about greenwashing. This is not just about lip service. This is actually about trying to make a difference. And I love how this little nudge activity of labeling a carbon footprint on a menu can help people, nudge people to make different decisions. Now, this is obviously a threat. I don't know, maybe it's not so obvious. It is perhaps a threat to some food production organizations and industries that are heavy in the carbon output. And it might mean a slight decrease in demand for their products. I'm looking at you, beef. And beef has had such a major uphill battle to prove that it isn't having such a big impact on carbon. So this will be an ongoing issue for all agricultural products, whether it's animal products or indeed other plant-based products. Measuring your carbon impact and making choices about it will become an ongoing issue. Soon we will have carbon reporting as organizations as well, where we have to not only report our financials, but our carbon impact. So you heard it here. Carbon is still sexy and still alive. Okay. On Planet Zoe, I am back from Canada and just back from Canada and still dealing with the jet lag. That is my last major trip of the year so far. There's only a couple of weeks left until Christmas, and then another big trip to Japan for skiing in January. It's been quite a big spring so far. I'll unpack this in the solo-sode coming up. What has this meant? What does it mean to be traveling all over the place? For now, I'm grateful for the chance to have connected with my family and the homeland, one of the homelands. I was born in England, grew up in Canada, and now live in Australia. So doing my tour of the Commonwealth, it was good to connect with my family that is still all there. So question for you this week is, how long does organizational change actually take? And what practical steps can you take to make it easier and potentially faster? My guest this week is amazing. His name is Karuna Ramanathan. He is an ex-naval warship captain, which when I read his bio, I was like, ooh, so excited to talk about that. And he is a leadership trainer for Singaporean armed forces. He has been responsible for some major change in those organizations, and they ain't easy. He's the author of this fabulous little book called Navigating the Seas of Change, and he knows about large-scale organizational change. And we have this very amazing intellectual conversation that is also practical for you about how to affect large-scale organizational change. Without further ado, here's Karuna. All the way from fantastic Singapore. Welcome to the show, Karuna Ramanathan.
Zoe, a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And it's been a juggle to get to this point because you are a busy human and there's a lot going on for you. So where to start? You have had such an illustrious career. How did you end up getting to this particular point in time? And along the way, what has been a career highlight for you?
Quite accidentally, actually. When you look back at 39 years, you couldn't have planned any of it. And it just happened one after the other. And I think that's a story with most of us. I just got very fortunate at times. At certain points in life, I thought I was being let down. I was letting down myself. But when you look back now, all these were little windows and gates that just kept opening. And it was just amazing. It started at 19 with being selected to attend the Britannia Royal Naval College from Singapore. That's in the UK. And there was 365 days of leadership training. And that's when I came out of my zone, to speak, so as to speak. I would contemplate the word resilience, and I often wonder why it's so hard for people to actually deepen and toughen themselves. But that's all that military stuff, right? It's all in the mind, yeah, of course. If you get into the David Goggins kind of thing, But the real thing that happened there was...
like, push yourself to the absolute limit until you literally break a few things. That's one way of doing things.
Well, you know what? That sounds very appealing when you're 15, 18, 19, or 25. But I think for people at my age, that's really going to be quite dangerous. So I think it's just the mind. It's the discipline of the mind. And that's really what happened. And we just come to accept the fact that we always have choices. And that dawned on me then. And then I had 19 years, that kicked off 19 years in the Navy, and I had 2 ship tour commands, and that was over 11 and a half years at sea. And after that, I actually had 11 years in the military, almost like it was a second career, though it was still in uniform, but I actually got privileged enough to be selected as the deputy head of the center, and we did a lot of experimentation things. I actually did my culture shifting experimentation work there, because that was when the Singapore Armed Forces was actually trying to move from a traditional military command and control, tell it all and get it done, to a one that would be assisted by technology and learning and facilitation and coaching. And it was just an amazing opportunity to see that happen. And it does take a bit of time. It took us almost a decade to make that shift. I was part of that team, a real privilege. And then when I retired, so to speak, from the armed forces, after 2 months short of 31 years, I actually had another opportunity, again accidental, Government was looking for someone to facilitate internal conversations between ministries and the statutory boards and the government agencies, because we were actually trying to do some transformative work. And because of the confidentiality of the conversations, I just found myself getting interviewed one level after another level, and suddenly I'm in a senior enough position to be government's most senior change consultant for about 3 months short of 3 years. Did some amazing work there, got a chance to do a bit of work in neighboring Brunei, if you're familiar with the territory. And then I'm almost 7 years out doing pretty much the same thing, and now specialize in transformation work, helping senior leaders and teams accelerate the rate of transformation while maintaining the dignity and respect of people in organizations, which I believe to be truly lacking these days. That's in a nutshell.
Oh, okay. Well, you just left a little bomb there at the end. So we'll come back to the bomb, missing the caring and dignity of humans. So I made a little dignity, write a little note there to visit that. I want to come back to one of the seeds that you mentioned earlier, this culture and change program, and the whole idea of moving from a command and control agency with a long history, a long heritage, into an IT-informed coaching-based approach in a military environment. That's kind of a massive culture change. Like, that's epic. And I know how, because I've done work with different Singaporean agencies, I know how difficult that would be to encourage people to shift their whole value set around that. So where does one start with that? And first of all, how did you envision that change, going from command and control to this new way of operating? Is that where you started?
Yeah, I think it's just a question of how you look at bureaucracy and hierarchy. And that was a good start, because actually, if you want to get real change going in hierarchical organizations, then probably the practice field is not necessarily the best way to start, because it's really long cycle work. The process frames are probably better. So people getting a few steps at a go to be able to slowly start to do things slightly differently, and giving them the time to discover the benefits of doing that and linking that to something that's visible enough as a result, and as near term as it might be, actually worked for us. So as an example, what we did was simply amplify a lessons learned process, and we just had 3 steps. Before activity review, which was before you get out to the field, you need to do a couple of things. And, with soldiers, they actually have force preparation, which means you pack your backpack. So this is just part of that routine. And then take a pause when you're actually huddling in a clearing in a jungle. You're stopping for a water break. Maybe you push another 8, 10, 15 minutes of that and ask yourself the fundamental question, what exactly can we do better? And that kind of thing actually pins things down quite quickly, because the idea of the leader being able to facilitate that by going, let's take a round, everybody, and not actually jumping in himself or herself to actually give the order, which is the default of the day. It is a profession, right? And then at the end of it, to be able to set some time to take in some thoughts as to, look, this went well, but some things didn't go so well. And if we're going to do this again, what might we need to become better at, or what might we remember? And that was just... It's simple, but it's not simplistic, because it does require some level of internal preparation to convert observations to personal insights. And what you're after are not the observations, you're actually after the personal insights. Then what we did was simply slap on an extraction mechanism on that final part, where you actually had an observer pulling that out and putting it in some kind of a knowledge system, and kind of then transferring that as opposed to sharing. So these are the kind of things that you actually can do. And after a while, it becomes habituated, because it's simple enough in a hierarchical organization to identify 3 more steps. That's what we did. It was the action learning process. It went very well for us.
That's amazing. And as you're talking about that, I'm like, oh my God, that's just so smart, because it's not intimidating. And when I hear the word transformation, as many people do, they will either get energized by it. That would be me. I'm like, yes, something completely radically new. Let's do it. And my inclination as a change agent would be clear the decks, sweep everything away and start over. And not everybody has the appetite for that kind of experience. No. And I suspect, if I'm going to put words in your mouth and then you can tell me if I'm right or not, that approach doesn't treat people with dignity and respect.
I think it just induces anxieties at all levels, and you can't really predict the extent to that happening in people, because I give an example just at a session, and I was just reminded, next week's workshop will be at level 21 instead of level 18. And I said, I don't really care where it is. I'm sure you've got a good room, but I tell you what I care about. I care about where I park my car when each time I come to this building, because I don't want to have the anxiety, it surprised some people, of having to look for it at the end of the day and not feel too familiar. So all kinds of things happen in all of us, and it's very difficult for a change agent to be able to estimate, or an OD consultant to be able to predict or anticipate any of that. So the easier thing, we make things for people. We might have a big plan, but I think chopping it up in stages and not being overly enthusiastic about it at the beginning it's lessons that I've learned over the years.
I think it's a really important tension to manage, because you need to have the transformative vision, and then to rein in my case, it would be like really rein in the energy, enthusiasm to go these little tweaks, incremental, and, little mini experiments. As you say, the description of the team stopping in the jungle and doing a debrief, essentially, of what worked, what didn't, and then having an observer capture that as a knowledge base it just feels so slow. And yeah, you have to deal with people like me who are just like, yes, let's go, hurry up, versus those who are terrified. And I'm curious about that. In your experience as a change consultant, looking at risk appetite I'm sure that's what part of it is, risk appetite and attitude towards change, not knowing what's in the room or in the building when you're coming in to do this kind of work. Is it important to find out the risk appetite, or is that just you just assume the lowest common denominator, which is people are scared?
For me, it depends on the nature of the organization. I would classify organizations, hierarchical organizations like enforcement, the military, they don't need much help, because they if they decide that that's where they want to go, at some point it gets going. That's for the U.S. Army. The Singapore military learned back 20 years ago, learned quite a bit from the U.S. Army's transformation. And so that's one side of it. But we also need to remember something really fundamental, Zoe. The profession of arms, it actually celebrates unlimited liability. So you actually have leaders. It's Samuel Hackett's piece of work, 958. It's quite seminal. Basically, what it means is the moment you are designated a leader in the military, and that could be at the lower levels and the middle levels, you actually accept accountability for people, and you're not going to do anything quite subconsciously to undermine that, because you've been trained for that, you're socialized into a system, and so therefore that resistance is about, what is this going to do to my people? I am not going to accept this. So when you work with these agencies, you actually have to accept that as a lower line or baseline, that this is going to be that. And I kind of reorganized that narrative a little bit in terms of the change narrative is essentially pivoted on the leaders' value add to the well-being of people. That comes quite naturally for those kind of environments. Now, when you swing to the other side, and I've done work in government, when you swing to the other side and you have government-type organizations and agencies, we struggle with accountability. And I think all around the world, talking to fellow consultants, you and me alike, we wish that government leaders were a little bit more in proactive. How did this person become so much of a leader? He's just a bureaucrat. But there's a reason for that. And this is in the context of our conversation. I'm starting to develop the theory for myself that there's no single individual in government who can explain accountability. But as a total system, the government is accountable. It's accountable to the political order, with the political bench. It's accountable to society. It's accountable to the country. But every individual in there probably believes they're doing a very good job, but they're part of a larger cog. Now, when you get into those kinds of change environment, change agendas, it's extremely difficult to get work going. Change work going in those kinds of environments. So the starting point is even lower, because you get all kinds of people dug in and not wanting to change anything. And until someone right on top says, get it going, and then they look up and they say, this is going to have to happen, there's still a lot of work. Some of the long cycle transformative work that you'll see, at least in this side of the world, is really, really difficult government pieces that actually has to be a complete reorganization. And that's where the mind shift really needs to happen. That it actually makes people very uncomfortable to step out of very narrow comfort zones. Now, the third part I will share is organizations. In organizations, the starting line is often, how safe is this going to be? Is this going to make me more successful? Because I think the appetite, or rather, how should I put it, the flexibility of hiring and firing is actually a lot easier with corporate organizations, and you do see people parting ways quite so quickly, which you don't see in government or the military. So it's in my book, because I actually say that these are three distinct environmental states, contextual states, for which if we are going to apply the same theory or the same approach, it's going to set us back quite in difficult land, because we don't kind of sense how people actually choose to operate, how they're socialized into a system. And it's our role to get in the system to the extent that we can read it while we work on the system, Zoe.
So let me just clarify the three change contexts. You talked about the military, you talked about the government. Is the third one the private sector? Is that where the third context?
Corporates, yeah,
corporates,
for profits,
okay. Yeah. So understanding the context is pretty important, because the approach will be varied, I guess, because of that.
Yeah, totally. The starting points change, and I think it's just being respectful. It's being respectful of a system, and that system is completely different. For example, if you get into academic institutions, I think the very second slide has to be definitions. You're not going to get to any good professor without defining something first. Sorry about that.
No, you need, before that, it's credentials. Like, these are my credentials.
Yeah, totally.
And that's to do with leadership maturity and where people feel comfortable taking advice from. Yeah. Have you done any transformation work in the higher education sector?
I stay well away from it.
And they're probably the ones who need you.
No, but I stay well away from it because we pride ourselves. So KR Consulting has been in for like 6.5 years. I mean, it's a small team that I lead here. And we take pride in, the one thing we do is we guarantee success. So we take pride in our diagnosis and our measurements and our methodologies, and we work in practical settings. I've just pin that down a little.
That doesn't say much for the opportunity for the higher education sector for moving with the times. So I hear that you just want to just park that one and we'll move on. It doesn't need to be a commentary on that. So large-scale systems change and transformation, you've had significant success in the military piece. What hasn't worked? You must have had some things that you've went, oh, that didn't quite work. What are some mistakes to avoid?
I think the overdrawn power is something we really need to deal with. Positional power is very heady. And I empathize with senior executives because they actually have a right to be there. I mean, there might be the imposter syndrome, which we kind of encounter quite regularly, but very hard to find imposters, So they have some self-doubt, but they're actually good people. I mean, they actually are qualified to get there. It's just that I think they don't realize the extent to which they're going to have to flex themselves, and that's where a lot of the problem starts. It's my way of thinking, it's my way of acting, and it's my way of feeling, which is okay in a generally orderly environment. But these days, I think, and especially since post-pandemic, what we're seeing is there's a lot of distortion, disruptions, and overuse of power then becomes a major defense against wanting to get work done. It's causing a lot of people a lot of grief. I'm not so sure about over there, but in Singapore, I'm actually quite disgusted with the continuing discussion around mental health. I think mental health is a state we should never be in. It just amazes me that we can still go on trying to fix mental health. We should not be fixing mental health. We should be fixing the systemic issue called leadership in organizations. And when we fix leadership in organizations, let's take it apart. The issue with leadership is never about power. Leaders get to power, but leadership is about influence, Zoe. So the issue then becomes, what are you going to do to become more relatable to others to be able to get them to do better work? And I think that warrants a fair bit of rethink.
Okay, so there's a little hand grenade in there, and just in terms of what you tossed over. So can you unpack this a little bit? Because I think there will be a few little bells ringing in listeners' ears. So we shouldn't be looking at mental health. And what we should be fixing instead are the systemic challenges in leadership. So if we unpack this a little bit, and I'm checking my thinking in what you're saying, are you saying that the mental health challenges, people's not feeling very at ease at work is one way of defining that, is not because they have issues in themselves. It's more to do with the system in which they find themselves, which is directed by leadership. Did I translate that accurately or not quite?
I prefer to see it that way. The conditionalities at work might need a little bit of a think, and the people who can do something about it are the people in positions. They are called leaders, but how we get to it is through the empathy, humility. Dealing with new constructs at work is not going to be something that the individual feels empowered to do without the leaders initiating and sustaining that kind of work. And that's leadership. Leadership is, when you're on a ship, you lead differently when the ship is in harbor. When the ship's in a storm, you lead differently. And right now, I think organizations are facing storms, a metaphor, facing storms. And I think what leaders are not doing enough are to look at larger systemic issues as to how people actually are starting to feel at work and starting to wonder why, instead of ticking the box with some mental health to-do list, and that's really, really where I think a lot more can be done.
Well, that's very refreshing. So the insight is fix the leadership, which should be fixing the systemic issues and not try and fix the people.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
And let's just drill that in. So now we actually start to look at not the top layer leaders, which is actually quite a narrow definition. When we look at positional leadership, it tends to sit quite nicely at the top conveniently, and these are C-suite, C- positions, maybe VP, SVP positions, and they kind of are in charge of functions and departments and divisions. But when we start to look at leadership everywhere, where would the key influence points be in an organization? And we quickly then start to accept that managers, middle managers, supervisors, project leaders, team leads, anyone who has responsibility not just for the work, but on deeper thought for people who do the work, might need more help in coming to terms and growing greater awareness as to the impact that they are having on people. And work is no longer a common denominator. Actually, people are the denominator at work.
I love that. And I'm curious about how you go about, as a change consultant into an organization, identifying, whether you have a system of doing this, identifying influence points in an organization. Is it a question of interviews? Is it a question of heat mapping? Is it a question of looking at an org chart? How do you actually go about doing that?
That's pretty straightforward. I think this is in the books as well. I mean, if the work we do is in change and transformation, and we are able to literally map where it always starts with strategy. Actually, that's the easiest part. You can actually pay people to write your strategy for you, But actually, once strategy becomes firm, at least over a time frame, say 2 years, 5 years, go to market, whatever, growth market, we then start asking, that's really the point of entry for my team and the people who do this work, What exactly do you need to see happen in the next year or two? And what parts of this? How might you pull some of that strategy pieces out, or at least the first mile, and cut that into projects that you might want to take to market, take into your system? And it's one thing to actually draw a couple of PowerPoint slides to say what's going to happen and do all those calculations, but there's underpinning strategies, and this has been said repeatedly, is successful execution. Execution is the space where the idea to do something better, for profit most times, actually would have to find its way into the internal organization. Now, then we take the step in the internal organization and start looking for heat mapping exercises as to which parts of that organization might actually potentially be involved in it. And then we drill that down into who the managers and the supervisors might need to be. And then we start you actually get that done very quickly. But that's the visible part. But you also have the informal network, because actually the paradox with transformation work is it can't be directed. It actually is knowledge work. And so we define knowledge as not knowledge, because academics fight over these definitions. But knowledge to us in the context of an organization is probably a mix of data, information, and wisdom. And then we start to ask where the knowledge mapping sites might be. And that's when you start to see informal networks. And then we pull people into a room and we kind of take a look at where they are in terms of their awareness and sensibilities, their skills and abilities, and maybe some hint of attitudes and beliefs, depending on how the organization is put together or how it's evolved. And then we run 2 programs. And I think this is the part that might be most useful. There is a need for change leadership. We don't call it change management, we call it change leadership, because the change leader is actually a sense maker, and he or she would probably need to hold vision. So vision is translated as holding up some part of the strategy for people to actually believe in. And we call it goals. You can call it anything. But we actually have a proprietary methodology that we built off the OKRs that actually kind of does that quite easily. The other thing that we do, which is the harder piece to do after starting up with a change leader's work, is maybe a year into the change leader program, we actually get into the adaptive leader program. The anchoring there is to help middle managers. Again, this is this 20-30% pool of people in the middle of an organization, often neglected and often overloaded, to actually do 3 things: cope, adapt, and learn better so that they can be more confident, adaptive team leaders. Now, the fundamental premise there is your work group is unlikely to be able to stomach the transformative work that we need to see happening in organizations, and cross-functionality is probably the ask of the day. But it's very, very unnerving for most people to have to believe that they actually need to stretch. Instead of looking up at the bosses and looking down at the people, you now have to look across. And that's quite unnerving for us, because our picture of success has been, as Simon Sinek said, you were promoted to manager because you were a good supervisor. And that's that. Now, the second part of this is I actually now need to develop a methodology as a manager for me to be able to do this work, to start working with people I don't terribly like. And
Always a joy.
yeah, how do you do that in a professional relationship? And that requires a bit of unpacking. So we run two major interventions: change leadership and adaptive team leader work. And it's worked quite well for us. Our success rates are actually somewhere in the 50 to 65% mark. And so that's quite phenomenal after a few months of work.
That is really good compared to the 30% success rate otherwise, which is quite challenging. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about your book. So you've released this fabulous book. What is its title and its purpose?
Well, it actually is navigating the complexities of change. I've experienced it firsthand at sea. The starting point for that is you can't draw lines on water. You can't map the sea. I mean, they're called sea charts. They're no sea maps. The only thing probably predictable about a ship, it's time in harbor, where you actually are designated a berth, and there's a way to actually kind of berth the ship, and you get all the help. But the moment you put out to sea, it's anyone's game, and you can't predict. I mean, you can predict the weather, but you can't possibly determine the extent of how that would actually shape your passage. So with that metaphor, and it was the second reason I actually wanted to kind of build the 19 years of my time at sea in the Navy into a little reminder that there was a lot of lessons learned, and how the sea is an extreme punisher of poor leadership. It has been for centuries, And in there, I then said, but this is not like an autobiography. And I wanted to tweak the book to kind of say, here are, how do you lead teams? How do you deal with change? How do you build a narrative? How do you give hope to people? What do you need to be clear about? And those are little nuggets. And then the third thing I said is, no one's going to read a 200-page book, so let's keep this at 75 or 80 pages and just get straight to the point, because I think as we get older, long-windedness is problematic for most of us, So that's that, navigating the seas of change, and I it's probably the only book that I'm ever going to venture into. I mean, it was careful work. People who read between the lines have asked me some questions because they know who the author is, and I get accused of not saying more, but I think I just drew the line at that, because I think we need to respect everyone and just leave it at that. But I'm really happy with it.
That's good. And it's a lovely book. And I'll make sure that we point people in the direction of your book so they can pick that up. I want to come back to actually one of the first things we started with, which was this idea of transformation change, where you go from one state, the example was command and control, to a consultative, coaching-based state. How do you actually conceive of the alternative vision state? So you're going into an organization. It's got a current existing way of doing. How does one imagine a transformational endpoint? Is there a methodology to that? Does it already need to be in place? Tell me about your process for that.
There are two key steps that we bring right up front, and we say that actually BAU, business as usual, is not going to get you very far. So, and there are at least 3 to 4 major transformational model methodologies. I mean, like there's the dual transformation model, but the simple fact of the matter is, if you've got 1,000 people in your organization, so you're going to have to deal with 1,000 people in your organization getting to the new state. You're not going to be able to you're not going to have budgets to raise your headcount by 500 people. That has been pretty consistently the view. I mean, you could reorganize the 1,000 people, and you could cut off some parts of it, which is what some organizations do as they move, say, from banks to banking or whatever, or going to e-commerce. But for a large part, that's going to induce a lot of unhappiness, and CEOs are reluctant to do that because they're really good people, and they have deep conscience, So what we then do is I literally capitalize on it. I said there are only 2 things that need to happen. And one is to get to this new state, you're going to need more data, more information, and you're going to have to leverage on wisdom. Either it's in your system or it's in the larger ecosystem. So how do we do that? And when you get those data flows going, it's actually a sense-making exercise, because all transformation work is generally complex and you cannot determine the solutions by simply identifying what we think are problems. And people get to that really quickly, because they can say, yeah, well, I have to think about this quite differently. So we kind of open up the knowledge system. And we can do that. I mean, it used to be called, some parts of it used to be called knowledge management, but my PhD is actually intuitive knowledge transfer, intuitive tacit knowledge transfer. So I go straight to the wisdom, and we talk about the relationship of how lived experiences and lessons learned and mistakes made can actually help you with your sense making to some extent. So that's one part of it. The second part of it actually is quite interesting, because it was Stanley McChrystal, I think, in his Team of Teams book, actually calling this shared consciousness. If you want to get ahead, you need to build shared consciousness. A lovely phrase that actually, captures, can we become stronger together in figuring out what we actually know? And that's the check. So I go into the knowledge system, we go in. The second thing we do, and this one becomes quite interesting to senior leaders, is empowerment would probably increase the productivity, effectiveness of groups of people as you move from work groups to teams. So we make a deliberate effort because all organizations are waterfalls, and you actually have the org chart, but that's not how teams work. It's often mistaken for actually teamwork is a part of the result of a good team, but it's not by itself a team. Teams are deliberate constructs which actually, for example, you move from jobs to roles. And when you start seeing that in an expanding way, you actually start doing more with your time, and you can actually move those transformative agendas in. And so the earlier example about change leaders and adaptive team leaders, these are essentially configurations around building teams. And the balance of that is actually on the priorities the organization wants to see. So we make two movements. We make the shared consciousness knowledge data flows, and we actually empower middle managers to look left or right and actually start building coalitions. And it happens quite nicely, actually, when people actually realize they can do more with what they have.
So what I'm hearing is the vision of the future state is an emergent, organic experience. It's not like, here's the picture of the new thing that we're moving towards, and let's backfill with a plan towards that. It's more, let's see the organism as it is and dissect it from its knowledge base, its network base, and let the ideas emerge from that entity. Is that correct?
Totally. Okay. It is the dialogic OD, organizational development approach. I mean, Robert Marshak's work, acknowledging that they are covert processors, they are not manipulative, they're not angry people, they are real people. And I know that you're probably going to ask me for what is the one code. The system is what it is.
No, I wasn't going to ask you that.
I think you would at some point. The system is what it is. It is what it is. And I think that is a really respectful way to start and become curious rather than go in with this is what you need to do. So we're not management consultants in this work. And I think if management consultants attempted this, it would be problematic. And I say this with respect for other consultants.
I like that. And at the same time, I'm like, wow, it's messy.
I am messy.
It's messy because there's no like step 1, step 2, step 3.
No,
not really.
So that distresses. It really distresses clients. I mean, like,
sure.
What are you gonna do? Can you explain these more? What are the next steps? We have a proprietary exploratory survey called the Adaptive Organization. Its sole purpose is it's not like an engagement survey. It actually is an online 42 set of carefully thought through questions that we have honed over like a couple of years as to how might we explain the knowledge state in an organization and its openness to change work. And I get asked, show me the questions. And that's even before taking the test. Show me the questions. How are these questions related to each other? I just got asked that yesterday morning in a session. And I said, some of you guys here are really ready for that PhD. I mean, like, look at the way you guys are going. I mean, you should contemplate that. But it's just that people really need to know. And that is the I need to be in control. There are psychological constructs there. I mean, it's major data points I take away from questions like that.
Well, adaptive leadership is new beliefs, new ways of seeing. And that is
totally
one of the most discombobulating experiences that you can go through. So if you want to anchor it in some certainty, I can understand why they'd be like, tell us the path. Just give us the solution and we'll work towards that, as opposed to working together to construct it anew, to birth it together, which is, like I said, messy, non-linear.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've been all over the place here.
Sorry, it's messy.
No, absolutely. Like, it's not a bad thing. This is because the conversation is amazing and your insight is amazing. So we talked earlier, you talked about, one of the places you start with, business as usual is not going to get you very far. And one of the questions I had for you is there ever a case for not changing or staying the same?
Oh yeah, totally.
There is.
There is. One of the worst things we can do in organizations that I repeatedly fall into trap with is changing corporate services. For example, procurement, finance, the legal team. Why do you need to transform them? They are people you go to for help, to get work done. They're part of a process. There are organizations that actually would not benefit from this transformation. And we need to be careful here, because actually the digital transformation agenda is really very compelling. But lawyers will still pull their bags with their pink files to court, and they're not going to carry an iPad and greet the judge.
They do in Australia. I can tell you it's happening here.
And so I asked this question of a client who was actually years ago, and I said, well, the ask was, how do you get young lawyers to actually leave their files behind and get on the digital system where search and retrieval is actually money we spent, And I said, you're not going to be able to do that. It's cultural. It's the fact that you actually need to note things down on a file, and you need to keep that with you, and you need to have that as backup. You need to have those law books. It's part of the context. It's the profession. So understanding that, there would be, to answer your question, there would be some parts of an organization that you would actually keep as clear, visible, and firm. And some parts of it, perhaps the parts that interact with the larger ecosystem, quite evidently, particularly you have organizations, government agencies interacting with industry partners or corporates with other partners, you would actually have to deal with those changes first. And after a while, it becomes very clear that not everyone needs to be treated the same way, the change way. Some people can actually afford to actually sit at the back and just hold it down.
Something in what you talked about, though, the lawyer example is particularly poignant because my husband's a lawyer and his business went through a paperless transformation half a dozen years ago. So as you're talking about that, I'm like, I know it can be done. And I think in terms of picking out the lessons from your observation in the Singaporean context, is you kind of got to pick the payoff. Is there a payoff, and how much resistance in the cultural norms is there to try and introduce this change? And I think is that one of the things that needs to be considered when you're talking about whether or not this particular section of the organization needs to change or not?
Yeah, we just had a team meeting with our legal team this morning, and we did it on Zoom, and we're all in Singapore, right? I mean, we could have easily found a room like, say, 30 minutes away, and we could have sat down. But we had that meeting over 30 minutes. As I reflect on it, I would say that pre-pandemic or prior to the pandemic, this would be unheard of. But attitudes have shifted, and you have Zoom, you have rooms, you can do all that stuff there, provided it's all secure and backed. So some parts of it are what we call thawing and unfreezing, but not everything you could expect that in an organization. And I just have some empathy for that. If this is how you think, now is it actually going to be detrimental to the overall equation, or can we hold you down as a constant while we build the other parts of you around? And then you make that assessment for yourself as to whether you need to tweak some parts of it. And that's, I think, always worked for us. Okay,
that's lovely. I like that caveat. All right, so on to the Fast Five. Are you ready?
Yeah.
That didn't sound that ready.
Yeah.
It's happening anyway, so here we go. Number one, what is the future technology you most want right now?
I think it's simply AI, and we don't understand that enough. And there's a lot that can happen there. And let me push that a bit. Issue there is actually with information, not knowledge.
AI with information.
Yeah, it actually accelerates the rate of information.
Okay. Number two, best tip you ever got for leadership?
Let it go.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is so apt. I can think of many times where it's just let it go. Yep. Fantastic. I'm sure there is some great stories in there. Number three, what's one problem at work or in the workplace you'd love to wave a magic wand and have be fixed right now?
Racism is problematic. It sits in different levels, and it is actually in our subconsciousness. It actually is something we need to deal with quite so seriously.
Okay. That's the first time I've heard that one, and it is such an important one. So thank you for sharing that. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Who's a leader that's doing something great? Thumbs up. Or if you want to, share a leader that's doing something wrong, give them a thumbs down.
I quite often wonder why mothers do not believe themselves as leaders. It's very easy for me to walk into a workshop and I say, well, how many of us have children? And you find the female executive, the lady executives in the room immediately put up their hands. And I say, well, you are a leader, aren't you? And they do phenomenal work of having to juggle between children and choices and responsibilities and risk. And you take a young mother who has to leave her 3-year-old in childcare, and you can imagine what's going through her head the whole day at work. Mm. And so you get dumbed down into power-based hierarchical order when actually you have a leader in there waiting to step out. And that's my point about the phenomenal under potential.
I love it. That is both a thumbs up and a thumbs down at the same time. I love it. It's like, you're a leader, great. You don't believe it, thumbs down. Okay.
No.
Number 5, what is your favorite leadership book or podcast?
I actually am drawn, and we use quite a bit of that. There are two. On the more practical side, I have Ronald Heifetz's book, Leadership on the Line, which is a phenomenal. I've read that, I think, about 6 times end to end. And each time I read it, I mean, like, manage your hungers, a balcony in the dance floor. You have powerful metaphors coming out of it. But, I mean, I had the privilege to know someone who's a mentor for a while, and he passed on. He was actually a U.S. Marine who actually served in Vietnam, and we worked for a while together. And so Spencer Campbell's book on leadership is very interesting. It is, I think it's about a 25-year-old book, and it talks about practical tips to becoming a better version of yourself, because your men and women whom you actually would work with can choose not to follow you, and I've always remembered that.
That's great. Thank you. And that was the Fast 5. The Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast is proudly sponsored by the Amplifiers Academy. It is an online self-paced leadership development program that you can join at any time and progress at your pace. There are very short video lessons, great checklists and resources and recommendations and book summaries, all there to help boost your leadership thinking and abilities. We focus on leading strategy, leading culture, leading change, and leading performance. So if you want a go-to resource that can help boost your strategic abilities immediately, check us out, Amplifiers Academy, on the ZoeRouth.com website. See you there. Moving towards one of my last questions, and how do we actually sustain energy for large-scale change?
Gosh, it's not going to happen in a year or two. So the source, I differentiate between pace and flow. Pace is often what senior leaders like to deal with. It's called timelines. It's called no later than, it must get it done. Strategy is all about pace, master planning, 2-year plans, 5-year plans. Flow is this metaphorical concept. If you accept the organization as a living system, it's like the water will only flow if you remove the rocks. And basically, you're going to have to do work in the center of the organization, the middle core, unfreezing the middle, so as to be able to create enough flow to actually sustain it. And that's first mile hard work, because that's where also the real resistance is going to be, because you're going to have to bump against people who actually would question you on threatening their notions of success. And it's hard earned. So I would say that basically that sustaining the transformation is about middle mile work, and it often is in the middle. It's where consultants really don't like working, because it's quite mysterious and it's quite tricky to actually get that. But the moment you open that up, so you actually start to see real change. And that's our point of measurement, actually. We never measure at the start. We measure a year or two into the transformation, and then we start deciding where exactly we could accelerate stuff and where we're not going to have to deal with it a little differently. So I would say that it's the middle of the organization that needs work.
Karuna, that was fantastic. And as you were describing pace and flow, being a Canadian, I'm thinking of a frozen river, which in winter, they're frozen. And the work of the long-term transformation change starts with picking away at the center of this frozen river until you get some flow happening and digging out the rocks that are in the way.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much. Karuna, this has been extraordinary. It's been such a delight to have you on the show and to be up close and personal to someone who's leading such extraordinary change, who's had such an enormous amount of wealth of experience, and so much I wanted to ask you about your naval experience. That's a whole other story. I just want to say deep appreciation for the work that you're doing and for sharing your wisdom on the show.
Oh, totally. It's actually my privilege that someone would listen to me for 50 minutes, and I'm really, really thankful for this opportunity. It's all lived experiences, Zoe.
Awesome. That was incredibly energizing. What an amazing leader. What an amazing human. Karuna Ramanathan. That was amazing. So, So apart from stopping to fangirl over the amazing interview, what are the key takeaways and take actions from this? And the question I have that's filtering is, what could emerge if we tapped the wisdom of teams? That's the question that's emerging for me. What could emerge if we tapped the wisdom of teams? And the central image for me is his story about the teams in the jungle, where you take an extra few minutes to do a round robin saying, okay, what have we learned? What's going well? What's not working? How could we apply this? And to capture that into a knowledge base. I think that's wonderful. And what if we did that in our team meetings? Okay, what's working? What's not working? And how can we apply that and capture it and move on? Fabulous. So the tip of the week comes from my fourth book, People Stuff, Beyond Personality Problems, an advanced handbook for leadership. And the chapter is about the practice of perspective, what Karuna talked about extensively in our interview. And there's a model I have here on page 19 where we talk about expanding, where we do sense making, and then focusing, where we make sense. And then we master feelings, where we use our compassion, and we master thoughts, where we master wisdom. And as we do that, we extend and include and distill and discern. And I think this is a useful paradigm for us. And when we start with sense making, as Karuna talked about, one of the things we do is expand our sense of time, where we look into the past, generations and generations and thousands of years, to see the trends and patterns and events that have shaped where we are today. And I think this is a useful exercise to do, and I've done it with a number of organizations to make sense of where we are here. And it helps us see the bigger picture. And then from there, we can look at complexity. That's another way of sense making, where we draw the interactions of the organization, and Karuna alluded to that as well. So tools for sense making include thinking of trends, thinking in systems, and thinking about meaning. What are the values being supported, expressed in this challenge? Okay, so that's it, sense making. I think that's our task for the week. Go ahead and read People Stuff and get a sense of how we can make sense of what's going on. Coming next up on the show is a solo-sode. So I'll be reflecting on the spring so far in terms of what it's spring here in Australia, and all the amazing interviews that have led up to this point, and what my thinking is about now and what's coming for 2024. So we're coming to the end of this particular season, and I'm going to share my insights on that. In the meantime, I would love to know what you're thinking about the podcast. Send me an email, zoe@zoerouth.com, or send a picture of where you're listening to. That's always fun to see where you are listening and where your great insights are actually being recorded in your brain as you listen to the show. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.